It's my pleasure to be here, and I thank you all for your attention. And I just want you to know, for folks here in the room and for folks on Zoom, this will be an interactive presentation. During the presentation, please feel free to ask any questions, especially for clarification. I'll leave some space at the end for Q&A, for maybe more detailed questions, technical questions, or whatever. But as we move along, I know that some of the material might be new to people, or at least the combination or the perspective might be new. So please feel free to ask questions. There are no stupid questions, because if you knew everything about reparations, then we wouldn't have to talk about it, because we would already be a balanced out society where race has nothing to do with economics. But we're not there yet, so that means everybody, including myself, has a ton of questions. So I'll do a screen share, and I've got some slides. So I've learned that not everybody likes to just listen without seeing something.
It's nice.
So again, my name is Jermaine Ross-Allam, and I direct the Center for the Repair of Historic Harms at the Presbyterian Mission Agency. And I like to let people know that what are we up to at the Center for Repair? We are always growing the number of human beings working to share the good news that repair and reparations make common sense, that is, for the common good. And we are looking to do that always, as soon as possible, but also for as long as it takes. And this is kind of my elevator speech. This is like the slogan, but each and every word and each part of that phrase is very meaningful, both to our history and to our theology as a church, because it is good news that repair and reparations is common sense for the common good. So we'll talk about that more. So the title is Preparing for Reparations. And the reason why I say preparing for reparations, because as we'll discuss, it's very important to understand the difference between reparation with a capital R and repair, which is something that's very closely related to it, but we cannot confuse the two and still do what needs to be done. Albert Camus once said, calling things by the wrong name adds to the affliction of the world. And I think that's a very important phrase, even beyond what Camus himself meant by it. And so in this presentation, we're going to make some really important distinctions, and then we're going to discuss what opportunities come about when we make those distinctions the right way and what connections become possible. And so I'll begin by saying, let's see. No, I won't tell you all that. Okay, so we'll just start here. So reparations with a capital R must be an act or a series of acts of a nation state or states, i.e. the federal government, in response to a call. Repair, on the other hand, is the work of the people. Where you see little asterisks, that those are opportunities where there might be a little bit more to say if anybody indicates that they have a question, but you don't have to ask a question, but it just lets you know that there's more to say there in case you are curious, and you are welcome and invited to ask. And then we'll also discuss the fact that repair must prepare the people to inspire the nation and its leaders to make reparations. So as we go along, we'll talk about what reparations means to distinct groups of people. We'll distinguish between what is meant by reparations for the Afro-American people as opposed to indigenous nations in this country and beyond. Yes?
Can you make it a little bit bigger?
Ooh, I hope I can. Let me see.
Don't think so.
No, okay.
I'm not. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Is there something I could repeat though?
No.
Okay.
I might move up there.
Yeah, there's a seat right here. There's a seat.
And I'll make a note of the fact that I need a bigger font. Okay. And so with this last one in particular, when I say repair must prepare the nation and its people to inspire its leaders to make reparations. This comes about because of a historical attitude that signals to all kinds of people that repair and reparations are bad news, that they don't make common sense, that it's better not to really touch it. And this is an old attitude. And it goes all the way back to the days when people thought the best idea was to give reparation to slave owners as a way of signaling goodwill, that the nation is not confiscating your property as an act of war, but as an act of reconciliation and hopefully as an act of peacemaking between white men who own property. Reparation to the people who have experienced slavery and the harms of Jim Crow and all of the things that come from it have always been something that people have pushed onto the third rail of American politics. And the notion of doing something to deal with the damage done to indigenous nations has also been one of those things that have been pushed to the third rail while the nation promotes an idea that indigenous nations no longer exist or don't have a permanent place in the United States. Yes, I saw your hand.
Did you say, could you say a little bit more about reparation to white slave owners?
Sure.
Did I hear that correctly?
Absolutely. So both in the English-speaking world and also in the Francophone world, reparations were paid to slave owners and in the Hispanic world. And the idea behind, well, and I should put it this way, after the outbreak of the United States Civil War, the idea was floated to give reparations to slave owners. That was decided against. People decided not to do that. Although those who emancipated enslaved people, I think in Washington, D.C., did receive some compensation. But ultimately in the United States, because enslaved people became understood as contraband, that contraband was then taken away from the rebellious states to prevent them from using that to further the rebellion. But the idea was on the table to compensate them. And certainly in states in the North where there was slavery that was given up voluntarily, I mean, through the law, but voluntarily, then compensation on some level there was important. And the reason why the compensation was important, because it was understood in English common law during that time period that to confiscate someone's property without due compensation is tyranny and is an act of war, after which there can be no understanding of a unified republic. And so in order to help smooth this process from being a slave nation or half slave, half free nation into a nation that would eventually be free of slavery, and we'll talk in a little bit about what this means to be free of slavery, it was understood that there has to be some sort of process by which the people who are giving up their slaves can still imagine that they have a way to participate in the life of the nation without having this ongoing grievance about the federal government taking our property away. And this is also some of the logic that goes into the notion of the rule of law within the society of nations, i.e. European nations and Anglo-Saxon descent nations. Some of this logic also helps us understand why it made sense at a certain time for certain people to require the people of Haiti to pay reparations to the French government, because the Haitian Revolution deprived generations of white people from the revenue they would have earned from slavery. And so the United States collaborated by hook and by crook, collaborated with the French government to see to it that the Haitian people were forced to pay reparations to the French. Because again, the Haitian Revolution, like the American Revolution maybe, gave people the opportunity to determine what freedom meant for them. But at the very beginning of that process, it was decided that the Haitian people would be treated differently and that they would have to pay reparations as a cost of their freedom. And those reparations have damaged the Haitian economy in ways that still affect its economic and social and political life to this day. So reparation is not unheard of, but reparation for the loss of private property makes more sense in the United States so far than reparations to the people who themselves were understood by law to be property. So we've got some Christian work to do. So when we talk about reparation as having a bad reputation or being a third rail issue, we can start with the 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama, and then we're going to go back a little bit in history to see some of where that attitude comes from. But Bruce Springsteen, I don't know if you caught this podcast that Bruce Springsteen and Obama did. I would recommend it for historical purposes only. But in this podcast, Bruce Springsteen and Obama have a lot of friendly banter of the sort that we're used to from the former president. And Bruce Springsteen asks Barack Obama, listen, you sound like a guy who understands systemic and structural racism. so why didn't you go for reparations when you were the president? And so Barack Obama said, as you can see on the slide, the politics of white resistance and resentment and the talk of welfare queens and the undeserving poor made reparations not only a non-starter, but potentially counterproductive during his presidency. That's what he had to say. And so I like to emphasize that although that does not make Obama a terribly courageous or imaginative person, but it does help us understand that he's talking about us. He was talking about us, saying that we're the reason. Now, we could also point it back at Obama and say other things, but it does remain a fact that he probably calculated accurately that the American people would not respond during that time period well to a call for reparations. Now, a different type of leader would have taken it upon herself or himself to say, well, I'm going to re-prepare the people so that they are prepared to do what's necessary. But that's not what 44 or 45 or 46 seems to be about. And so when I said in this previous slide, repair must prepare the people, that's us, to inspire the nation and its leaders to make reparations. What I'm saying is that this seal of the office behind Barack Obama's head, and I'm sure he knew that it looked like a halo, which in classical art signifies that someone is inspired. You know, it's an ancient Egyptian symbol to have a halo behind your head, which shows that the sun and the God of creation is with you and inspiring you, that you are a special one. And I do believe that Obama wanted that type of symbolism associated with his presidency, but he was not inspired enough to say that systemic racism is real in America and therefore this is what we must do. So it's the job of the people. It is the liturgy, as we say in church. It's the work of the people to inspire the nation to know what it is that the faithful people of the country expect their leadership to do. Albion Touré, we're going to go a little bit further back to the 19th century, was also a very, very important leader and a dear friend of the Afro-American people who was inspired to do many things. For example, he was the primary lawyer in Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson is the Supreme Court decision that unfortunately decided that separate but equal made sense for public schools, private accommodation, or rather public accommodations, etc. Albion Touré argued the losing side, which meant that he thought people should not be assigned a caste based on their skin color. He even tried to say that race is a kind of property. And this was an argumentation he used, and it's kind of clever, but it didn't work. But he tried to say that race is a property that people have, especially white people. And if you look at a person and you decide, oh, I don't think that person is really white, they need to go to the colored section of the train, he said, well, you're depriving that person who may very well be white of the property that they own in their whiteness. Pretty clever idea. And many people believed that idea, but it didn't work. He lost the case, and separate but equal became the law of the land, and Jim Crow, of course, held sway until the 1960s in the United States. But Albion Touré was also a novelist. He wrote really good novels. One is called Bricks Without Straw. Another one is called A Fool's Errand. And his novels are based in the Reconstruction era. He doesn't write Black characters very well, so don't read it like you're gonna, he doesn't write Black characters
Could
very
you
well.
repeat those two titles?
Bricks Without Straw.
Okay.
And then the second one is called A Fool's Errand. And these are kind of propaganda pieces where he's really trying to show the plight of freed people in the Reconstruction era. And they do a good job of really showing you the conditions Afro-Americans were subjected to and what the social attitudes were that made it very difficult for anybody who wanted the Reconstruction to make citizens, full citizens of Afro-American people. Nevertheless, Albion Touré said some things that I think we should wrestle with. And by the way, I just want to say, in this presentation, I don't focus on what very racist people on the right wing have to say against reparations, because that's low-hanging fruit. That's really easy to see how terrible that sounds. But I'm using the opinions of people who I think are probably closer to the positions of the people around all of us in this room. People who want to do the right thing, but don't want to go too far for fear of backlash. So that's why I'm focusing on some folks who in other arenas were very helpful. So Albion Touré said these three things directly to ex-slaves this is in the 1970s, I believe, when he said this. He said, slavery opened to the slave not only the pathway of civilization, but the gate of heaven. So he's trying to put a positive spin on what slavery did for the enslaved people. And I'll have to tell you, some of our favorites in the Afro-American historical tradition also used some of that same logic. I don't want to name names, but Henry McNeil Turner was one of them. It's a heck of a drug, but and Touré also said reparations demands would jeopardize civil rights for Afro-Americans. And then Touré also said reparations demands nourish a sense of injustice and ingratitude that distracts from the cheerful recognition of the free people's true status and duties of citizenship. So he's presuming that actual citizenship would be in the possession of the free people if they would just look forward and not look backward. So some of that language might sound familiar to you. So keep in mind, this is before he tried and failed, Plessy versus Ferguson. He was among those people who really kind of did believe, and I do believe him in this way, that let's not look backward, let's just look, turn our face to the rising sun, so to speak, and hope for the best, and good people will do the right thing and everything will be fine. And there may have been a good reason to have that hope during that time period, but this is part of the logic behind his reparations denial. And I'm not saying that to make excuses for him, but I want us to have a way of making sense of how we've come to this point in the 21st century and how we have come to this attitude that is now prevalent.
So we think those statements were made after the conclusion of the Civil War, but
This is-
before he did the Plessy versus Ferguson.
Certainly, yeah, in the 70s, right. Which is not to say he would have changed his mind, but there was some optimism, broadly speaking, about what freed people could achieve and what after a bloody civil war people were prepared to do. And of course, as we see, people were prepared to not do those things and really hunker down. And so I'm gonna ask you to volunteer to read here for a minute out loud, if there's like a person who just likes to read out loud. See how there always is, all right? Never fails.
To see the boy.
Right, that too. That's always
Get out your binoculars.
That is so funny.
Okay, I can see to that.
Yeah.
right. So I'll ask you to read this slide, and then I think there are 2 slides with this on it.
Okay.
Maybe 3. But it helps us understand what the attitude about slavery was and what getting rid of slavery was supposed to accomplish.
Okay. Well,
Uh-oh.
That was
Uh-oh.
sneaky.
maybe I'm not saying too loud.
My fault.
Sneaky.
When we are free from this plague spot of slavery, the curse to our industry, our education, our politics, and our religion, we shall increase more rapidly in number and still more abundantly be rich. The South will be as the North, active, intelligent. Virginia, rich as New York. The Carolinas, as active as Massachusetts. Then be peaceful purchase. The Anglo-Saxon may acquire the rest of this North American continent. The Spaniards will make nothing of it. Nay, we may honorably go further south and possess the Atlantic and Pacific slopes of the northern continent, extending the area of freedom at every step. We may carry thither the Anglo-Saxon vigor and enterprise, the old love of liberty, the love also of law, the best institutions of the present age, ecclesiastical, political, social, domestic. Then what a nation we shall one day become, America, the mother of 1,000 Anglo-Saxon states, tropical and temperate on both sides of the equator, and count her children at last by hundreds of millions, and among them all, behold, no tyrant and no slave.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Beautifully read.
Well
It's a very
done.
good cold read.
And what's
So-
the name?
So this is a statement by Unitarian minister Theodore Parker
Oh,
in 1854. Theodore Parker was an abolitionist, and he was a white man who, as an abolitionist, suffered quite a bit for being an abolitionist during a time when abolitionists were the scum of the earth. And a lot of anti-slavery people would refer to and treat abolitionists as the scum of the earth, because again, they were advocating confiscation of private property by a government that had just fought a war against the British over this very same principle, or so this is how it was understood. And so Theodore Parker, again, is someone who we consider nowadays a liberal and a progressive. But for him, if you will go back, this plague spot of slavery was something that made the United States morally unfit to be in its expansive empire, which is to say, how can you get the moral confidence and maintain the moral confidence of other white people, of other Europeans, if you're doing something other Europeans understand to be barbaric and stopped doing quite some time ago? And so this is the attitude, and this is important, not because emancipation was a bad thing, but it helps us understand why an emancipation without compensation made sense. And it was because people were not thinking about the future of the United States as a multi-ethnic democracy. It was not what people were planning to do by and large, but instead slavery was a moral stain that prevented the United States from manifesting its imperial destiny. And that was on the minds of some of your best liberals, who nevertheless did incur a lot of danger and sustain some social and economic injury from their anti-slavery and abolitionist stances. But it's important to realize that it was not in order to have multi-ethnic democracy.
So I was interested as you were reading that it was talking about all this expansiveness, but total disregard for the Native Americans who may have already populated that area we were going to expand into.
Right, and so you can see from the picture that I have here in the background, this is the lady that you see. Her name is Columbiana, and she was an invented goddess. And goddesses and gods do get invented at some time, but usually we think it's in the murky depths of primordial history, and that's typically when a lot of them come about. But Columbiana is a 19th century invention, and I think she also stands on a pedestal with a torch, and she's the emblem of, what company is it? A film company.
Oh, Columbia.
Oh, of course, there we go. Right. And so these symbols, they show up in different places, but you'll notice that she's bringing, light and goodness and liberty from the east to the west, as she's directly above and guiding settlers who are also going to the west. But you also see indigenous people in the bottom left-hand part of the screen. They're running away. And in the distance, and you notice she's coming from the light, bringing light into the darkness. So that should remind us of some early kind of political, theological poetry from folks like Cotton Mather, who we discussed yesterday. This idea of light and dark, and saving the land from the devil, and planting cities, and you should hear the word planting as plantation. So all of this is part of the American mythology, which is also not mythology in the sense that people aren't doing it, because people are doing it, but it's part of the understanding of what the United States is as a city on a hill, a light in the darkness. And so Abraham Lincoln, as we're about to see, as well as others, were a part of this idea that America is an exceptional nation. But how can we do the exceptional things in the world if we have this plague spot of slavery on us? This preoccupation with making America good is not the same thing as making America a multi-ethnic democracy. And these things are actually, in a sense, opposed to one another as they're imagined by Protestant Christian people and others. And so if someone would want to read this next 2 slides.
I'll read it.
All right, thank you.
But very quickly, just an observation of Columbiana as well. She's carrying that book, which is connected to a communications line. There's a single communications line going back to the light, which is kind of
Right.
powerful as well.
Right, which is a telegraph wire.
Yeah,
Which is also about, she's spreading the idea of America. She's spreading commerce and industry through communications networks,
Mhm.
so the symbolism, I think, is so native to us. Sometimes we don't know how to call the elements out for what they're saying, but this is about expanding, a military industrial way of life at the expense of anyone who is not willing to be assimilated. And of course, this is a time period just before Indian removal was understood to be complete as America manifests its destiny, which is America's understanding, as old as the Pilgrims, that God gave the United States the duty to save the land from the mismanagement of indigenous nations and to deforest it and to plant neighborhoods and cities and transfer populations across the world and to use slavery as long as possible to render that land fungible and to make that land profitable and ready for white settlers. And so these things go hand in hand. And so we'll talk about this relation in a bit, but I wanted you to be able to see that sort of through the painting because there is an understanding that this is part of the divine providence of God, that this is obviously how God's providence unfolds, and it's just too bad for anybody for whom this is bad news. So this is a kind of good news, a kind of pseudo-gospel, if you will, of American exceptionalism.
Sharon has her hand raised too. I'm not sure if she.
Oh,
I
thank you.
do. I have a question about the artist of this painting. Who is it?
John Singer Sargent? That's
It
my
is-
guess.
It's not, I can't remember the name of the artist, and I wish that unless it's in the bottom.
And the reason I'm asking is because I don't know if I'm just imagining it, but over in the left corner, I'm facing, the bear doesn't look too happy. He actually looks like he wants to attack her. And that to me speaks about the environment as well.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that observation. Yeah, there is, in Puritan American literature and other literature, there is a very strong sense that the devil and demons exist and thrive in places where you have what appears to the English mind to be wilderness. And so,
See a bear.
I wish we had.
It's in the dark over here.
Yeah, in the dark on the left, the low at
See,
the bottom.
Oh, okay, got it.
There we go. Yeah, so for me, American landscape painting and British landscape painting is not really the kind of painting that is really thrilling to me. But one of the things that we do realize is that those paintings have a lot of political and theological ideas in them about what is light, what is darkness, what is devilish and diabolical, and what is angelic and what is providential. And again, if you have, the kind of the curiosity, Cotton Mather, a Puritan American religious and political thinker, is a very important person to read if you want to see the development of a political, religious, poetic sensibility that really reflects the idea that civilizing Europe, and especially civilizing the British Isles, required deforestation and a certain kind of urban planning, if you will. And part of the way that the gospel is manifest in the so-called New World is that you use that very same procedure and you bring it to the United States. And Cotton Mather very fluidly and in a very kind of clever and sophisticated way associates indigenous people and African descended people with nature. Nature as this sort of wild, diabolical home of the spirits that have to be sort of organized and tamed in order for the providential structural order of God to become manifest in the New World in a way that saves the New World from the mismanagement, so to speak, of indigenous nations. And so chasing away these wild beasts and making a way for these stagecoaches that you see in the picture and the settlers that you see and this light and this communication infrastructure and the railroad, which you also see here, the railroad, shipping lanes here on the East Coast. It is to say, let us make the rest of this continent saved and providential in the West, just as it has already been done in the East. So all of this is what is in the mind of the leaders of the American people as we are figuring out what does it mean to put an end to slavery. So that's part of what is being thought of, which helps us think of who and what is not being thought of.
I have a hand raised.
We knew, we were just trying not to interrupt.
Okay. I can't, in listening to this, I can't help but think about what's going on with Russia and Ukraine now, and looking at the context of Anglo-Saxon people deciding that the destiny and manifest destiny of territory and their providential enrichment, coming at the expense of people who are already living in a place and being intruded upon, and their whole history and existence just kind of being a speed bump or spot on the obstacle on the way to what is the Anglo-Saxon, destiny. And, that's a parallel that plays in my mind as well, because if you would listen to Putin, he would tell you, that his destiny is to reunite what was the historical Soviet Union, which is why he annexed Crimea, is going after Ukraine. And, it's for everybody's betterment without even asking the people who already live there if that's what they agree to. And he alone has decided that. So I get a sense of the more things change, the more they stay the same. Except what do we learn from that? And, I'm really curious as to my friends in the room, because they know I don't have a problem with challenging them and what they think. How do they feel about something like that, where this is a theme that has carried on through time and time again, and in different ways in different continents?
All right. So thank you for that. As they say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But someone, from China, who is a good friend of mine, always reminds me, in light of the long history that China has, that there's very little in the United States that we could rightly say is old. Which is to say, the things that are happening right now aren't necessarily for us an instance of history repeating itself. It's actually just historical processes as they've been engineered unfolding, as people in some cases have hoped for them to unfold, because the United States is not that old. I mean, my grandmother was born in 1910, so that reminds me that, we're living in the unfolding of plans that have been underway for some time, but they're not so ancient that we can't have some cause and effect relations. So moving along though, so if I could get someone to read this one.
There we go.
Right.
As part of one nation, its people now find and may forever find their way to Europe by New York, to South America and Africa by New Orleans, and to Asia by San Francisco.
Hello, why can't I?
There we
Okay.
go. But separate our common country into two nations as designed by the present rebellion, and every man of this great interior region is thereby cut off from some one or more of these outlets, not perhaps by a physical barrier, but by embarrassing and onerous trade regulations. Abraham Lincoln addressing Congress in 1862.
All right, thank you. So this gives us an understanding again that for Abraham Lincoln, slavery gave certain people the power to simply frustrate trade, to make people who live in the interior of the nation unable to do trade internationally. So again, I don't think anybody anymore thinks of Abraham Lincoln as someone who was in love with people of African descent. We understood that he was a politician and he did what politicians do. But it helps us to understand that getting rid of slavery had many practical functions beyond having multi-ethnic democracy in your imagination. So for Lincoln, it was about maintaining the capacity of the United States to control the Pacific, to control the Caribbean through the Gulf of Mexico, and to at least have open access to markets in Africa and beyond without having to go through a separate nation that's hostile to the United States, which does tell you something about our geopolitical strategy as it exists right now. It's not something that was just cooked up by this president or the last one, but it's part of a long-range plan that, again, is very different from imagining multi-ethnic democracy. I'm going to, I'll go through some of this pretty quickly just in the interest of time. But this attitude that's not geared toward reparation is also present in other people, like Afro-Americans who are sometimes conservative, sometimes not so conservative. And I'm gonna minimize the part of my screen that shows me the people on Zoom, so I won't be able to see you on Zoom because I want to be able to read my own screen. But a prominent Afro-American conservative once said that issuing reparations payments will incite racial resentment. And this is in the 90s when someone said this, so we're moving back to, closer to this century. Provoke charges of extortion against all Black people from other races, especially recent immigrants scrambling to make it on their own. It would validate to whites that Blacks are not patriotic. The more things change. Validate to whites, end the moral responsibility that all Americans have for the history of slavery, legal segregation, and the ongoing racism in national life. And I'll have to tell you that someone who, I won't say their name, but when I began to study as a doctoral student, reparations, someone also told me, be careful with this talk about reparations because it might jeopardize people realizing that there is a responsibility for ongoing systemic racism. But reparations might push it too far and it would jeopardize the reality of other forms of anti-racism. So this is not an uncommon complaint. This was all a list of things here from Juan Williams, I'm not sure.
And you said this was 1990.
Right, this is in the 1990s. So this is a more recent way of basically saying what Albion Tourget said. This is someone who would probably position themselves to the political right of Barack Obama. But you can see how when it comes to reparation, a lot of people are saying some of the same things.
We have a question down here.
Just a quick administrative question. By any chance, will these slides be available to participants?
It's possible that some version of them will be.
Okay, that's what I wanted, yeah.
Right, and by having people's email, and you can also help me kind of coordinate some of that.
Yeah, I have everybody's emails that submitted
Okay.
requests for the,
Wonderful, thank you.
to be part of it, so.
So in her book, which is actually a very interesting book, and I do recommend it, and she was also a teacher of mine, full disclosure. But in her book, Lose Your Mother, renowned theorist and historian Saidiya Hartman says that she has personally grown weary of pleading our case and repeating our complaint. And she says there is something innately servile about making an appeal to a deaf ear or praying for relief to an indifferent and hostile court. Saidiya Hartman is a wonderful teacher. She's the mother of, even though she doesn't claim it, and sometimes denies it, but she's mother of the people that are sometimes referred to as the Afro-pessimists. Her book, Lose Your Mother, is a very interesting book.
Sounds interesting.
So yeah, it's very interesting. And Lose Your Mother is really about addressing the feeling of nostalgia that Afro-Americans have about the motherland, the mother country, Africa. She raises some questions that help people say, well, really? Is that your mother? Is this how a mother behaves in terms of the history of the slave trade? Interesting book, lots of arguments with it and against it and around it for me, but interesting. But this image on the left, again, this image comes out of the British abolitionist tradition that began in the late 18th century. This was a very fashionable image that would sometimes be, it would line a snuff box, or it would be part of, it would be a brooch or a hairpin, because it was something that liberal upper class British women were able to use to mark themselves as a kind of progressive, worldly and cosmopolitan philanthropy class, so to speak. And this image, of course, and you can't see it, but you may be familiar with that slogan that's written around the perimeter of the image, which is raising a question, am I not a man and a brother? And of course, it shows an image of an Afro-American man in chains, asking somebody above, we don't know if this is God or if it's just the good white people, to recognize his humanity. This is a complicated image because, like other pieces of abolitionist literature, it appeals to the moral conscience and the humanity of people who are clearly in a position to do as they will with that appeal. And many people have complained then and now that this is an improper image to be consumed by the descendants of the enslaved, because it allows you to imagine that your well-being is subject to the good graces of people who may or may not have it in their interest to do the right thing. And this is part of where Saidiya Hartman is coming from, which is to say, does it do us any good to always be sort of begging and pleading our case before an indifferent and hostile court? I'm gonna skip through some of these things, but reparations, what are reparations? So the United Nations Commission on Human Rights acknowledges 5 forms of reparations: restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and then finally, guarantees of non-repetition. And then to move on,
Can you show that screen real quick?
Sure.
I couldn't get my phone up fast enough, I'm sorry.
Okay, all right.
Waiting too.
So restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition.
My phone won't go in focus, of course. There we go. Got it, thank you.
You're welcome, you're welcome. And so in COBRA, or the National Coalition for Blacks for Reparations in America, they say that reparations is a process of repairing, healing, and restoring a people injured because of their group identity and in violation of their fundamental rights by governments, corporations, institutions, and families. Professor William Darity, an economist at Duke University, and if you only read one book about reparations, which I hope you read more, you should certainly read Professor William Darity's book, written along with Kirsten Mullins, who is a folklorist, not an economist, which makes it a much more readable book than it would have been otherwise. They wrote a book that's now in its 2nd edition, and it's called From Here to Equality. And again, if you only read one book about reparations and you want it to be the relatively short one and not the big, long, comprehensive one, I would recommend their book, From Here to Equality.
And who is the author?
This is William Darity and Kirsten Mullen. So Darity is on the screen, D-A-R-I-T-Y, and Mullen is M-U-L-L-E-N. The book is called From Here to Equality. And together they argue that reparations, and this is with a capital R, must be community specific. It must permanently close the racial wealth gap, and it must bring closure, after which there is no more grievance left to state.
You think would that really ever be possible, the second bullet?
That was my question.
Good question.
Yeah.
It's a very good question, especially for people who, I say this often, if we can affirm a woman giving birth to a child without a man, gives birth to the Savior, who can be killed and be raised from the dead, then we have to add, I think, to that same context, this question: can we permanently close the racial wealth gap so that wealth and poverty no longer depends on a person's relationship to an emancipation without compensation? It's very much a question for faith that must be answered with fidelity.
That was a good answer.
It almost feels like to me, though, that we abolished slavery, but we really didn't do anything about education or, equality. We jumped ahead and here we are now, and now we're kind of going backwards to start over.
Mm-hmm. It's true, and this is one of the things that happens when you're giving a presentation and not writing a book, is that it is important to know, especially the Presbyterians, some of us, really did lead the way in saying slavery is terrible and it caused really horrible deficits, and we need to educate people to become Christians and citizens. And Presbyterians really put a lot of effort into doing just that, but they lost. Because there was backlash, there was political pressure, there was terrorism. Presbyterians built schools that were burned to the ground by terrorists in the South, and eventually money dried up, political will changed. And so now is the time to resume these old responsibilities. But I don't want to paint a picture to say that nobody tried to do the right thing. There were many people who tried to do the right thing and they simply lost. And some people risked a little bit more than their money and their reputation to try to do the right thing. And people lost their lives, they lost their livelihoods, they lost office, they lost a lot. They failed. And so now is the time to resume some of those possibilities that were foreclosed at the end of Reconstruction. This image shows a little bit of what is understood by like the racial wealth gap or the racial wealth disparity. We won't go into it into detail, but the green, all the green that you see on the screen is white household wealth. The black is Afro-American household wealth and the red is indigenous household wealth. And so you can see how race plays a role in who has what. And what you're looking at here, you're looking at average wealth. So we know that just because you're white doesn't mean you have all the money that whiteness might imply. So these are numbers that are looking at the aggregate. And it's showing like how much, for example, here, racial wealth disparity grows almost $850,000 and $850,000 and $915 respectively, which is to say the average white family has this much more than indigenous nations and Afro-American people as a result of an emancipation without compensation, land removals, etc. And also through withholding 14th Amendment protections from Afro-Americans so that they become subject to Jim Crow regulations, redlining, cannot take advantage of things like the, I'm forgetting it, GI Bill. The GI Bill was mandated federally to go to everyone, but was administrated on the state level, knowing, of course, that the states will make a decision at the expense of Afro-Americans, but provisions were not made to override the state's Jim Crow provisions, so that white families were able to benefit tremendously across generations from the GI Bill, and rightly so. But the federal government did not do what was necessary to make sure that Afro-American veterans and their families were protected from Jim Crow regulations, taking that right away from them, even in the face of so much service.
I just wrote, we were just talking about a legislative Feinberg in South Carolina, because he is championing legislation to get Black GIs from World War II compensated, well, their families compensated for that. And I wrote him because of a conversation that just randomly came into my head when my father said, I wish I could help you with school when I was starting college. And of course, I didn't know what he was saying. And, I just told him my story. My father fought. And so much went on with him fighting in World War II as a Black veteran, as many, and he went missing for a period of time. And he and his mother was very, very disturbed when her own son was missing. And she ended up being killed in a hospital. He missed his mother's funeral, and still he came home and wasn't compensated.
Wow. Wow. And unfortunately, stories like that are all too common. And so this is again part of why when people talk about reparation, they're talking about real things, but we don't receive information in our nation in such a way where what happened with your father, for example, is something that everybody should know. People should know that this was part of the structure of how wealth was transferred for some and how it was structurally deprived from others. We're not a nation that knows how to tell this truth in a way that takes the burden off of individuals from seeming like, oh, you're just pleading, you're making a special case. It's a special pleading, it's just whining, it's just this. So a lot of people get quiet and they don't want to say that because they don't want it to seem as if they're not, a team player, or that you're just whining about something that, you're crying over spilled milk. Like it's painful for people to try to explain that kind of stuff or to work through that rhetoric. And so it's really important for people of faith to be able to hold those truths, especially so that people who have been traumatized and subjected to these oppressions don't have to suppress so much just to tell the basic truth about the economic history that is actually structured and planned on very high places.
I want to take it back to the slide before about the financial So the green represents white, black represents black, and red indigenous. So it takes it back, and there's always triggers. It takes it back, so I have an HR background. And in my position, I was able to see the compensation for everyone. So now, let me just give you history that there were only 2 Black women working in HR. Everyone else, white women, white men. So as I'm hiring, I did all the onboarding, all the recruiting. I'm hiring someone for HR. I have a master's. He had a bachelor's, white man. He had less experience than I did. I was at the job, had more experience than him, higher education, and he made over $15,000. It was probably more than that, more money than I was making. And I was frustrated, like, it's a frustration. It's a frustration because I feel like we have to be, and grandma always said, you have to be 10 times better. You have to do, you have to do so much more. And it's like we go and we,
To get half as much.
to get half as much.
Right.
It's a frustration.
It is.
It's a frustration.
And this is something, if you're fortunate, your parents will tell you this as a kid, before you have to find out. So that you're just ready for it.
Right.
That you have to, you have to work twice as hard to get half as much. And even then, no one's gonna secure it for you the way it will be secured for other people in a court of law, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is part of what makes it necessary to talk about reparation, not simply because people are angry about slavery and want some money for it, which we can talk about that too. But it's because an emancipation without compensation and the government's refusal to uphold 14th Amendment protections affects the economic life of families across generations. And, and my friend who produced a brilliant report and is getting so good, much quicker than I am about making data easy to understand with colors. He's a white man, that may or may not have once upon a time voted for a president whose name starts with the R. But as a person in banking and finance, he was able, by looking at the numbers, to understand there's no way an entire ethnic group of people is going to climb out of this deficit by pulling themselves up by bootstraps. By looking at what the actual numbers are and the processes. People who know numbers, they understand this is not about anger, grievance, culture, bygones. This is a structural deficit that has to be dealt with on a federal level. And the reason, of course, why we're talking about it is because before it can be dealt with adequately on a federal level, we have to be inspired enough to know that reparation is right, necessary, and possible, so that we can then inspire our leaders not to ignore this historical development any longer. Because right now, they're not inspired. And it's probably because we're not inspired enough to take it upon ourselves as religious people to say that the breath of God is in us. We can certainly do better than what we've done before. And this is what we have to develop within ourselves. Instead of this, oh, well, it's tragic. Oh, it's too bad, but nothing can be done. We have to do a little bit better than that. And I can see the signs that we're moving in that direction. Yes, that question, and then I'm gonna kind of move kind of fast after that, but I still want to hear your questions and comments.
I'm just wondering if you know the repository for some of these stories, the story that you shared about your dad, the story that you shared about hiring a white man. Is there any central source of what you know that is collecting some of these stories that might help humanize this conversation?
There's some literature out there. Heather McGhee, for example, who people keep telling me about Heather McGhee. I haven't read Heather McGhee's book very thoroughly. I've kind of clipped through it. At first, well, I won't say that. Anyway, I'll read it. But it's a book called The Sum of Us, like S-U-M, like The Sum of Us. People tell me that those stories really, really help them start to open up their eyes to how these disparities have impacted families in a way that shies away from, charts and figures so much, but in human stories. The book Cast by Isabella Wilkerson is one that I've heard people talk a lot about this book.
We're reading it for our African American,
Yeah.
our anti-racism
Yeah.
community, sorry.
Yeah, and that book came out
What's the name?
just after I read her first book, which is a classic. So Cast for me didn't really do for me what her first book did, and I happened to read them both in the same month, so that's probably why. But Warmth of Other Suns is a really wonderful book that helps people understand people were experiencing outright terrorism in the South. Legal terrorism and federally aided and abetted terrorism. And people left the South looking for, the warmth of other suns, so to speak. And they went to Chicago.
So SUN.
Yeah.
In this case, right.
Okay.
Thank you, yeah.
I was like,
SUN.
because I was gonna say.
Right, not those.
I would love to see it be a video collection, because many people will not read it.
And just to be clear, it wasn't about hiring the right man. It was about me feeling less than because
Right, of course.
I did everything I thought was right to be compensated appropriately.
Yes.
And then to have someone come in, whether he was red, white, yellow, purple, or green,
Right.
not have the education, not have the background and the experience, and
With the
I
company.
with the company.
Right.
Yes.
And I still don't make as much money as he did.
Well, you
That
had-
was my frustration.
Yes.
You had
You know,
two strikes against you.
Exactly,
The color of your skin and
exactly,
being
and
a
a
woman.
woman, exactly.
I just wanted to say that for all of you interested in doing this, there is a really good exercise on bread.org, Bread for the World. It's a racial gap exercise. I went through it and I thought I knew a lot and my eyes were completely open. And it talks about the historic legislation passed
Interesting.
down, and it's called, I can't remember the name of it, but it's a racial gap exercise, and you can do it with a group. I would recommend doing it in your churches. It really, it's an eye-opener, bread.org.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah.
I've heard people say that really helped
It's-
open their eyes.
It's incredible, yeah.
Because part of what has to be overcome, again, is that because people don't like to read books, and a lot of us don't like numbers and facts and figures, a lot of us are blind to the fact that even though you may feel, ooh, something's not right, something's not fair, but sometimes that can just be, it can sit within us as a feeling until we're able to externalize it and say, wait a minute, this is not just a feeling, although the feelings are valid, but there are structural inequities. And those structural inequities compound in such a way that you do what you're supposed to do,
Right,
and you still come up short.
right.
And you don't know who to tell, you don't know how you're supposed to feel, you wanna have the right attitude and just kind of hunker down and take care of your business and not be a whining person. But then, it wears away your health, you just don't have the resources, and you realize, no, like something's off and it's not me. And so that's part of what we're getting at. I do wanna point out though, for indigenous nations sometimes use the language of reparations, but they are very clear that reparation does not cover all of what is required for indigenous nations to have just relationships with the people of the United States. And so for indigenous nations, reparation requires recognition as sovereign nations. And at the Center for the Repair of Historic Harms, that is also an important part of what we do, which is to make sure that we distinguish. We don't blur different reparation claims together for all kinds of reasons, to respect people, but also to make sure that repair and reparations does what it's supposed to do for distinct communities. It's not about skin color, it's not about culture, it's not about hair texture and all these other things. It's about what happened to distinct groups and what those events have cost the descendants, which is very different. And so recognition as sovereign nations, which also includes local, state, and federal sovereignty in criminal and civil law. So the ability as nations to try your own people, to have jurisdiction over your land. This is a part of what reparation is. It's not entirely everything, but it's part of what makes indigenous nations reparations distinct, even though they don't always even use the language of reparations. But it's very important to the PCUSA, especially now that the General Assembly has mandated that the PCUSA pay reparations and give an official apology to the Tlingit community in Juneau, Alaska, for closing their church in the name of racial integration. And that has damaged that community enormously. And I'll be leading a delegation in both September and also in October to learn how to properly deliver these reparations and then to finally do it. And so this process is going to become a model that I'll later share with presbyteries and churches about how to go and do likewise. Because they're helping us understand on the level of the local society and even in terms of epigenetics, what it meant to close a church that had been set up as a segregated church, but people took the lemons and made lemonade, and it became a center of the community, and then they closed that church in the name of racial integration and dismissed that pastor in a very racist way that now we are just beginning to learn, what did that cost the neighborhood? Generation after generation after generation. Now that urban renewal has begun to make that land that used to be indigenous land look very much like every other generic piece of land with a lot of real estate nobody can afford and big box stores that you can see in Juneau, Alaska, or Orlando, Florida, or New York City, or anywhere else. So we'll be saying more about that in the future because the model that we're using and the model that they're going to help us learn is going to be helpful for local churches to begin asking questions about their own activities and histories and how to make new relationships that reflect an ethic of repair.
You know, there's something wise in what your Asian friend said with nothing being, just things unfolding. And, you know, yes, slavery was abolished, but you almost have to ask yourself, was it really abolished or was that just stage one? And things are just unfolding.
Yes, ma'am. Someone once said, okay, so I don't know if I said it or someone else said it. I think I blended a couple things together, and that's how it's gonna come out. Is that with the abolition of slavery, you didn't close the plantation, but the boundaries of the plantation simply expanded.
Yeah, absolutely.
And part of what that means is that slavery was important for establishing the United States and striking a balance between non-slave states and slave states and respecting the right for people to own private property in human beings was something that the early founders and other political economists understood. This is the glue, I kid you not, this is the glue that holds a nation together. Respect for private property, whether you hold that form of property or whether you don't. But respect for one another's rights in that private property was understood by many people to be the glue that held the nation together. And so
Pastor Jermaine, I'm so sorry. I don't want to interrupt. I've been holding my tongue for about 10 minutes and you're just making the affirmation when they were sharing about all the things that made it relative and the discrimination. I am a granddaughter of a Methodist tent preacher in Seminole County who the Ku Klux Klan rode on. I have a 94-year-old mother who was a victim of a Klan domestic terrorism. So we don't have to go back in ancient history. It's living among us. And our churches, Lake Nona and Washington Shores, have done a lot of work on that. The one thing that I think is illustrative and it flows right into your conversation is that, you know, our two churches went to Montgomery, to the Legacy Museum and the Monument to Peace and Justice, but I also went to the African American History Museum at the Smithsonian in DC. And one of the things that sickened me was to see the 300 patents that were held by George Washington, the father of our nation, you know, who everybody reveres. And never mind 1619 and all up until the you know, Revolutionary War. We won't even have to discuss that because we know that happened. But the fact that he owned hundreds of slaves and has 300 patents that begin the accumulation of wealth and the theft of our wealth, because who really believes that George Washington had hundreds of slaves sitting around while he went out and figured out how to create farming tools in addition to founding a nation and running a war. And all those enslaved people sitting around watched him create all these tools. We know what happened. The slaves created the tools, and he took the patent and he took the money that came with that. And from that beginning, which we know began far before, because if Columbus came here in 1492 and the slaves arrived in 1619 and they were working ever since, that began the institutionalized racism and theft of our wealth building as we labored for free, and we created all the tools that built this country. And the property owners received all the wealth and compensation for it, even when society shifted. And it started with the founding fathers, George Washington, who created patents that, you know, for the rest of history through his descendants, created wealth that came from the invention, the creativity, and the labor of people he owned. And if you don't understand structural racism, that ought to make it crystal clear, and should also lay the foundation for reparations. Because if you want to take it to the beginning, which that isn't the beginning, but it certainly is a good place for you to start and look at where wealth was created and taken away from Black people, that's where it is. Because I don't believe for a minute that George Washington sat around and let his enslaved people just work, and then he said, oh, I got the idea, this is how you do it, and I'm going to go and get this patent. No, he watched his slaves created and create efficiency in their labor. And he took their ideas and he patented it and created wealth. And the people who actually owned that never got it. And that is your case for reparations. That is your case for structural racism. And I'm sorry, I just couldn't hold it a moment longer.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing, Nina. And okay, so I say a lot of book recommendations, but I try to only recommend the best ones. But since we're talking about George Washington, there is a book called Never Caught. And it's by, I want to say Erica Dunbar Armstrong, but I may be getting the Dunbar and the Armstrong mixed up. But Never Caught is a book about one of George Washington's slaves who ran away and was never caught. And it's a really good book. It's the kind of book that a precocious fifth grader could probably read, but it's so full of historical facts that are woven into such a well-told story. It's worth reading because it not only tells you, okay, so George Washington owned maybe 100 some odd slaves. The rest of the hundreds were Martha's, and Martha brought those into the marriage from a previous relationship. But because George Washington was a man, he had the responsibility of control over her slaves, even though she owed those slaves to the relatives that she shared from a previous relationship. Why is that important? It's because when George Washington became president and the White House was in Philadelphia at the time, Philadelphia had already abolished slavery and had passed a law saying that you can bring slaves to this area, but after 6 months, they are by law free. George Washington was out of town when a friend of the family came over and told Martha Washington, oh my gosh, let me tell you this before it's too late for you, like it was too late for me. After 6 months, your slaves are gonna be free. And I don't know how, but the slaves know this and they're just being quiet about it. And you can, in Never Caught helps you understand how George Washington and Martha Washington and Tobias Lear, the Secretary of Washington, made arrangements so that not only would nobody know that Washington was doing this, because Washington wrote in his diary and wrote in his letters showing that he was very self-conscious, that he wanted to be seen as a man of the people and as a fair and humane person. So he wanted it to happen very quietly, that a rotation would be established, whereby the slaves he owned would go from Philadelphia back to Mount Vernon and have some others come and take their place in a slightly less than 6 month rotation, in order so that Washington would not lose not only his own slaves, but so he would not end up compensating Martha Washington's family from another relationship for the slaves he could not maintain control of in light of the law. So you see somebody circumventing the spirit of the law, but doing it in a more or less legal way, but also doing it knowing that it doesn't look good and asking Tobias Lear to conduct that affair in such a way that it is under the radar because it mattered what other people thought. And in addition to this, he still lost enslaved people. Ona Judge was the personal body servant of Martha Washington. She was known all around town. She was in not photographs, but in newspapers, known for looking really good. And she even said herself, like, I didn't have to work that hard. I was always wearing good clothes, but my freedom was worth more to me than the fact that I lived better than most white people did. And so she escaped slavery, even though they tried to, I want to say hunt her down, but hunt is not really the right word. Because again, George Washington was a morally self-conscious person who did send spies and other people to try to pursue Ona Judge, but Ona Judge knew how shallow he was. And so you're not gonna drag me kicking and screaming out of this place because you know it's gonna make the good president look bad. And so she was able to stand her ground and actually maintain her freedom. And she died early and she died in poverty and she was sick. But she said, she's like, I don't care. She said, because I became a child of God by stealing myself from those people. You know, and she even talked a little smack about them, you know, saying that they, you know, they never really prayed sincere prayers. They only prayed those mumbling prayers written on papers, and they didn't teach me how to read, she said. She said, because they didn't teach me how to read, I was not able to know who I was in the sight of God. Really good book called Never Caught. A lot of really valuable historical context and old documents, but told in a really good storytelling style. All right, now I'm gonna really speak. So I'm skipping a whole bunch of things about CARICOM, but just know, well, I'm gonna say one thing about CARICOM. CARICOM has this to say about reparations, and I think this is key. CARICOM is the Caribbean community. I'll go back a little bit because I do want you to get some context. CARICOM is a Caribbean community, and it's made up of, it's a collective of 23 nations. And those 23 nations, of course, in the Caribbean contain indigenous people, African descent people, Indian descent people, as in the country named India, also Europeans, Chinese people, Portuguese people, Javanese people, and as I said before, indigenous people. So it's a diverse group of people who have a reparation claim that's distinct to the individual nations, although they work together as a collective, and their reparation claim is distinct from the Afro-American people of the United States claim. They say some very interesting things, but this is a part that I think is very important for the PCUSA. CARICOM says that victims and their descendants have a duty to call for reparatory justice. Their call for justice is the basis of the closure they seek to the terrible tragedies that engulfed humanity during modernity. I especially hone in on the fact that CARICOM says that it is the victims and their descendants who have the duty to call. Now, sometimes when I present people, and I've presented this before where I don't say who said this, because I'm curious to see what people are gonna say, and I kind of thought I knew what people would say, and people would say, well, that's not really fair because you're putting the responsibility on the victim. And I think the person who said this was imagining, as I thought they would, that it was a white person saying this. But there is something about the Caribbean community that is a little bit different than some features in our Protestant anti-racist tradition, I'll just put it that way. And I think it has something to do with the fact that the people of Jamaica and the people of Haiti dealt with the problem of slavery very differently than what proved to be successful for the Afro-American people. And the Caribbean people are people, for all kinds of reasons, who are composed of folks who who did things to get rid of slavery, who stood up and took their power into their own hands, paid the consequences, but took their power into their own hands, understanding that liberation is what you have to do. It's your right and it's your duty. And so I think this is important, in part because for the Center for the Repair of Historic Harms, we can't tell other people what reparations should be for indigenous people, for people of the Marshall Islands, for the people in Colombia, for people in South Africa. It's not for Louisville to say, oh, this is what your reparation is, come and join us. So I say that the Center for Repair engages in a call and response repair ethic, which means, according to CARECOM, the descendants of these victimizations, they will call for repair and reparation. And it's the job of the Center for Repair to respond to that call by listening to that call and then coming to an understanding of what that has to do with the Presbyterian Church USA. And usually it has a lot to do with the Presbyterian Church USA, one way or the other. But the respectful thing to do is to honor what people call for, to negotiate it, because people are sovereign entities, churches are sovereign, but to negotiate it, but to listen for the call rather than tell somebody else, oh, this is what I think your reparations are. Although people can kind of figure out what has happened and what has been done. But I like this, that the CARECOM is putting the onus in the hands of the people. Call for reparations. Don't say, oh, because we're Christians, we have to focus on forgiveness and reconciliation and forget the past. No, you call for repair. You call for reparation, and you trust that your siblings in Christ will have enough of the Spirit of Christ in them that they will be eager to hear what is necessary and what is right and what is possible for moving forward into a just future together.
Do you find in working with CARECOM that the people who are calling for repair are younger people compared to older people in the islands?
So I do not work with CARECOM yet, but soon I'll be making a visit. But it's a variety of people. There are a variety of people, but I would say from what I've noticed, there's a strong contingency between like 35 and 55. In addition to some younger college age folks who are also understanding the call for reparation.
Because I have family from Barbados and St. Thomas, and what we do. And I find in talking to them, the younger people will talk about this. The older people are just, and my aunt lived until she was 113.
Wow.
And
Blessing.
they won't have conversation. I have a older cousin, and she's in her 80s, and she'll say, I've never seen racism in the United States. And it's like, what?
And this goes back to what we said earlier. There has been in previous generations the understanding that, well, okay, if you just let bygones be bygones and just mind your own business, decent people are gonna let you live, and eventually you just live into the American dream like everybody else, which is not a satisfying thing to propose, even if it were to work. But we realize that not even that works, because white supremacy is not simply something that people did once upon a time because it was that time period and that's how it was, but it was an understanding of a global organization. It was the understanding of a population transfer. It was the understanding of expansion that was not just, oh, some old-fashioned idea that's just from that time period. But it's a plan of understanding, no, there's a group of people who are above other people and who have the right and the duty to expand because they're God's chosen people. And so that's partly, I think, why the older generations really didn't want to talk about reparations, because they were just trying to not get lynched. They were just trying to get a job, to not, not to be run out of the neighborhood, just trying to hunker down and do basic things.
And a lot of trauma.
And a lot of trauma. And a lot of trauma, for example, like, we'll just talk about it right now. I mean, we'll get there in a second, because I want to get there properly. But Callie House had to say this as we transition to talk about what repair is and how repair is different from reparations. Callie House, you should read Callie House, the book about Callie House. Callie House was not a writer herself, and she went to great pains to say that I'm a barely educated woman who is doing the work that more educated people should do, but they won't do it because they're preoccupied with integration instead of doing right by our people. But Professor Mary Frances Berry wrote a brilliant book about Callie House, and it is well worth reading.
Will you say that name again?
Mary Frances Berry. She wrote a book about Callie House that reminds us that reparations actually got started as a movement in the church, particularly for Callie House, the Primitive Baptist Church. And Mary Frances Berry is also a member of the Primitive Baptist Church. The book is called "My Face is Black is True," and it's taken from a phrase that Callie House says, and it uses her, freed woman's diction. My face is black is true. Like, it's true, but without the T, because that's how she said it. That's the name of the book. And she was a woman who started not a global movement, but a national movement to get pensions for ex-slaves so that they could die with some kind of dignity. And she said something very, very powerful that is recorded in Mary Frances Berry's book. And she says, enslaved people were released from slavery without compensation and were forced to look the man in the face for something to eat, who once had the power to whip them to death, but now have the power to starve them to death. And so this idea of like the man, we're gonna explore this phrase a little bit here. And of course, the man can be a woman, can be a man, can be a non-binary person. The man is the one who has the power, who once had the power to starve you to death and now, or has the power to starve you to death after having the power to whip you to death. She's talking about labor. She's talking about facing a world where you are not protected by your government from the people who are still angry about losing a war in the attempt to try to enslave you. And so when we talk about repair, we are talking about recovering from exposure to the man, exposure to looking that man in the face, man, woman, whoever the man happens to be. And she was a person who decided, well, I'm going to stare them in the face anyway and say what's owed. And, we'll talk about what happened to her. She was ignored by the Afro-American business and professional leaders who were focused instead on integration, because integration is what's going to finally get us integrated, and we'll no longer have to talk about slavery and compensation and reparations and all those things, they thought. So they ignored Callie House. Callie House was harassed and surveilled by local and federal agents. She was pilloried in Atlanta and Nashville newspapers with inflammatory invective from many people, including a local judge, who was later instrumental in having her thrown in jail. She was thrown in jail on charges of mail fraud. And the mail fraud charges were bogus, but were based on the assumption that reparation is so ridiculous that she could only be engaged in fraudulent activity because it can't possibly correspond to anything anybody would actually take seriously. So Mary Frances Berry's book deals with these details and really shows you what kind of a sham trial it was and how many of the people who were bringing the charges against her were actually themselves guilty of much more serious crimes, but the heat wasn't on them. But the heat was on Callie House, and it destroyed the movement. But repair requires self-evaluation and what I refer to as environmental transformation. This is how repair is different from reparation, but it's closely related because repair work is what prepares us to signal to the nation that you can no longer ignore the reparations claims of Indigenous nations and Afro-Americans. And so I'll say a little bit more about environmental transformation a little bit later, but it requires a self-evaluation where you have to ask yourself, and I mean ask it in a complete sentence and answer it for yourself in a complete sentence. What do you declare about God? What do you declare about human beings? And what do you declare about yourself? If you deny that reparations are right, necessary, and possible. So repair means that you have to ask yourself, and this means whether or not you are of the community that must help pay reparation, or if you are of the community who must call for reparation. Questions go both ways. People would ask somebody in a position like my own, young man, who exactly do you think you are? And why do you think you're in the position that you're in if you don't need to carry the responsibilities of your ancestors forward? And these are also questions that our theological tradition allows us to ask about who do we think God is? Do we think God is a white supremacist? Do we think God is someone who offers cheap grace at the expense of other people? And what do you think Afro-Americans are? What do you think Indigenous people are? Are they people who just disappear? They don't deserve to live. So these are really difficult questions that, we have to be able to ask ourselves. What are we really saying about God if we can see the damage slavery, the settler process has done to people? And we see that people are still around, but we're like, oh, well. So we have to really be clear with ourselves, and we have to ask ourselves and our colleagues and our church members, raise these questions and be really clear with yourself. What are you really saying about God? And so repair is local action. Local action. It is not national action. It's not federal action that has the capacity of closing the racial wealth gap. It doesn't have the capacity of returning sovereign relations to indigenous nations and the United States government. Repair is what happens locally. It's not beside the point of large-scale reparation, but it's in relationship to it. And examples of it are reparations for redlining in Evanston, Illinois. I've done some work and some consulting with people in Evanston to try to figure out, how did you get that done? And one of the things that I learned visiting Evanston is that they collaborated across denominational lines and even across religious lines. And a man helped me understand, who was a president of a synagogue in Evanston. He helped me understand that when you have religious people in your congregation and you want them to do something that they think is political and not religious, said, do not try to twist their arm and make them do something that they don't think is part of their religion. He said, instead, lean into your religious tradition so that it becomes clear to them what the religious tradition requires of them. And so he walked me through this process and showed me this is what, for a Jewish man and for a Jewish congregation, was necessary for them to understand that reparations for Afro-Americans in Evanston, I put it in the category of repair, but in their language, reparations for redlining in Evanston is a Jewish responsibility. This is a conclusion that he drew along with his congregation. And it meant going back to Torah, going back to Mishnah, going into the Talmud, reading Jewish case law and case history, and showing that as a Jew, he says to me, you are responsible for making things good where you live, whether you personally did the wrongdoing yourself. He said, this is a Jewish tradition. We're Jews. It's a Jewish responsibility. And they work together to put an understanding of this in the church liturgy. So people who just come to church for religion can see this is what the religion says. And I learned this by the repair action happening in Evanston. Princeton and Columbia theological seminaries have acknowledged, as if people didn't already know, that they were enriched by slave money. And especially, Princeton helped to produce theology that justified slavery and justified a laissez-faire approach to slavery among people who didn't like slavery but thought going along to get along was the Christian thing to do. Rosewood Massacre, the Greenwood Massacre, people there are demanding reparations to the survivors, the surviving relatives of people who experienced that. But I still put that in the category of it's a local action. It does not do what has to be done on the federal level, but it's important. Lansing First Presbyterian Church, restorative actions at the Synod of Lakes and Prairies are also doing very different things, but they're doing things on a local level that helps people understand that repair is right and it's necessary and it's possible. I'm on the board of trustees with restorative actions, again, full disclosure. And that chart and that graph comes from Jim Kuhn, who's a financial officer at the Synod of Lakes and Prairies, who's also a member of restorative actions. It's a great group of people, and I'm always about making connections. So talk to me about that. And again, the Presbyterian Mission Agency Center for Repair, of which I'm the director, is also involved in repair as a local action, even as we also support the passage of HR 40 and other large-scale reparations for indigenous nations. Specifically, I am spearheading an international alliance for repair and reparations, and I'll begin the first phase of that in the fall. And again, that will be an alliance that helps to move the reparations movement among a distinct group of people who will be in solidarity with one another's distinct calls for repair and reparations, but more on that later, because I will be talking in some detail about how the Presbytery or some entity within the Presbytery can become a member of this alliance, which I'm very excited about. And then, of course, Pittsburgh Presbytery, who I visited just the week before last, they are beginning a reparations task force, whereby they're going to begin a process of understanding what has gone on in Pittsburgh, between Pittsburgh African-American and white churches that might need repair. And so that's a part of local action. Going back to what Callie House was saying about the man and having to stare in the face of the man. Repair is part of what prepares us to emerge as people who humanize personal and institutional relationships by repairing all of the damage done by devolving into the man, which means assuming that the man is a permanent part of the world and you just need to be him. As a woman, as a man, as a boy, as a trans person, whatever. We have to repair all the damage done by those of us who have done what we need to do, thinking that we have to just devolve into the man as if that's the only thing to be, or striving to emulate the man, or even cowering in the face of the man. Having to stare into that face, trying to get some bread to eat, keep a job, it can turn you into something that you don't want to be. Regardless of your ethnicity, regardless of your status, gender, people cower before the face of what they believe is an unnegotiable and inevitable power. And we have to repair from that so that we can then say what needs to be said and do what needs to be done. And also we have to repair from discouraging others to call for repair and reparations. That means members of the church, going along to get along. Even when you think that you're teaching somebody the survival techniques that they need in order to survive all kinds of things, including the Greenwood massacre, etc. There still has to be a process of recovering from having done what needed to be done to survive, so that you now can call for what needs to be done boldly and effectively. So repair is all part of that. This is part of why I reflected on Obama, because Obama reminded us that until the people call for repair and reparations, it's going to be easy to caricature reparations. It's going to be easy to just say, oh, it's just a grievance, it's impractical, it's impossible, it's divisive. All that is so easy, and politicians are not typically in the habit in our country of trying to inspire people to change the direction, unless corporations inspire them to try to inspire them. It's our job to be able to say, yeah, we know the history, but this is a new day. We are looking to the future, and we're not looking at the past, which means we're looking at the past as a way to move forward to the future. And that's necessary for repair movements. And all of this is to say, repair that is done on a presbytery level, on a state level, on a city level, has to be a process where we make friends. This is very different than anti-racist circles. This is what I mean when I say environmental transformation. I think I don't have to go into too many details to let you know that there are certain ways of talking, and there's certain kind of, I don't know what you call this, there's a certain atmosphere sometimes in anti-racist circles that seems to not be too terribly serious about results. And sometimes our anti-racist environment can sometimes be a kind of Olympic competition to see who gets the gold medal in oppression, or to see who has enough intersectionality points to be able to, sorry for using you as an example, but
It's okay.
I've seen it happen where people, for all kinds of reasons, may look at someone who looks like you, and I don't want to say too much about your background, but would see someone who looks like you and realize, well, you're the person who's the least authorized to speak in this room. You're the person who might just need to sit in the corner and put on a dunce cap, and we can just say things to you without really knowing you and make assumptions about you, as I'm doing right now. And there's a way in which that simply doesn't work. Reparations requires a really diverse group of people with a diverse skill set to come to the table and sit down, as I said at the very beginning, get this work done as soon as possible, but to stay at it for absolutely as long as it takes. Not because we need to drag our feet, but some things, if they can only be done slowly, well then get started as soon as you can. And we need to be able to do the work of repair with people who know how to be ambassadors, and with people who know how to be diplomats, with people who know how to be bean counters, with people who know how to engineer solutions. And those people are not always the ones that are welcome to come to a book club discussion, so to speak, when it's about anti-racism and I have this skin color or I have this gender, and so you get to just sit down and shut up and listen to me wail on you. I've seen that happen in a way that doesn't really create an environment where the right people can stay at the work until the work itself is done. We need people who know how to get up from a meeting just like this and go and talk to other white people who maybe would never want to come to this meeting and persuade them to say, you know what, let's talk about this because we need your skill set. That's the kind of work that is difficult, because who wants to talk to that person who won't acknowledge this, who won't say that they have privilege, who won't, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, somebody has to do it, because we need as many people as possible to understand that reparation is right, that it's necessary, and it's possible. And there may be some language that you might have to use that could persuade somebody else to see the light that might turn my stomach if I had to hear it. But I certainly need you to do that so that we get the right people at the table to do the work. And I think that's a kind of thinking that requires us to transform our environments. Some people are so traumatized by their experience of racism that they're not good coworkers right now in either anti-racist work or repair and reparations work, because they're traumatized. They don't want to answer people's questions. They don't want to deal with people's skepticism. And it is okay to recognize that about yourself and opt out of that part of the work and do another part of the work that you are good at doing. But what is also important is to realize that as church people, we have to understand that we have to be in the work of transformation. The Holy Spirit is in the process of transforming us, and the Holy Spirit invites us into an environment where we are helping to transform other people, not because we're God, but because God created us to be co-workers with God. And so when we talk about repair, we're talking about every human being that has a skill to offer this work has to be, in one way or another, brought to the table so that they can roll up their sleeves and offer what their skills are, even if they don't have the right vocabulary right now, even if they haven't read all of the ethnic studies and liberal arts things, because we need folks from the engineering department. We need people with diplomatic skills. We need people who know how to count. We need people who know how to do all kinds of things, because this work is massive and it's very important to get this work started. So I'm gonna move here very quickly to close us out. I was gonna tell you all about the 7 stations of repair, but I'm gonna skip it for now and just say that in the PCUSA, we start geographically and historically with acts of repair, which is to say, we have to ask what has happened that requires repair as it concerns the Presbyterian family. And that means that we do prioritize, in my first station, the biological and cultural genocide of indigenous nations and the theft and defilement of lands under indigenous care. The PCUSA has to prioritize that relationship, because that is part of what the PCUSA from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast has damaged. In my second station, we deal with the hereditary enslavement of African descended people in the US and the exclusion of Afro-Americans from access to 14th Amendment protections. That is, when I say a second priority, it's not really saying less important, but I mean, numbers are what they are. And historically, Afro-Americans have been second in line for the damages of racism, slavery, and colonial processes. Third, the invention and the imposition and the enforcement of arbitrary norms of gender and sexuality, especially in order to populate and to finance a white man's country. What this means is that we do not major in gender and sexuality issues. Other parts of the PCUSA take that as their main thing. But we understand that it's part of racism. It's part of what has to be repaired, because you use gender and sexuality to reproduce a slave workforce, and you use gender and sexuality in order to transfer populations from Western Europe to the colony. And so enforcing gender and sexuality norms on men and on women and gender non-conforming people, that's part of that process. So we acknowledge that this is not our center, but we let people know that we are also looking to be in connective and responsible solidarities with people who also take this problem as their central issue. And I skip some because there are a lot of stations, but the 7th station of repair deals with the systemic distortion of the gospel around the planet in support of US American imperial projects, and the distortion of the gospel in order to suppress resistance to colonization, chattel slavery, and wage slavery. There are people who say, well, what about working class white people who you're not doing so great either? I say, well, you're not the central focus, but we see you. Like, is not forgotten, because that is also part of the race concept, is how do you make sure that you split working class white people away from African people so that they don't collaborate and name their mutual enemy. So it's not our main focus, but we also acknowledge that this thing works in more than one way. And also the sequestration of women's bodies. Christian gospel and the Protestant gospel has been used to do all of these things, and we have to always be in a process of repairing our theology, because our theology has been put into the service of doing those damages, and we not only have to stop the damage, but we have to do the intellectual and the spiritual and the ecclesial work to help people understand, listen, we've messed up. And that has to do with how you do Bible study, how you do, of course, sermons, how you do confirmation class. So there's a lot of repair to do in its creative work. And of course, the infinity station, which I just have to go there, it means that this is the ongoing production of new possibilities through faithful and practical and humane patterns of sustainable creation and routine repair, which means just like the people in the oil and gas industry who realize that we have to constantly repair our equipment so we can keep doing business, it's the same thing for our entire society. Repair and reparation has to take place in these big dramatic ways, but it also needs to become a normal way we do life. Because creative people who are always building things, you're gonna get things wrong. You're gonna damage things, you're gonna have bad processes, you're gonna do things that require repair. So instead of making repair something people have to pull your teeth, why not just acknowledge that repair is a normal way to go about doing all of the things human beings do? Because you're always gonna make mistakes, even if you don't live long enough to see what your mistake is, the next generations will. So why not signal to future generations that we're doing our best sometimes? And we expect next generations to actively repair the damage that we don't get around to doing, so that people don't have to make this campaign again and again and again as if repair and reparation is somehow a fanciful thing that has to just be made up out of whole cloth. So I'll stop there. You guys had a lot of active participation, so I'm glad. So we didn't get to go through like every bit, but I'm available for your questions and comments and follow-ups.
May I make a comment? This is Sharon.
Thank you.
I wanted to wait because all along I did have some emotional ups and downs as you were talking about reparation. So I'm glad I waited till the repair. I'm a descendant of a syphilis study trial member. Cleve Patterson was my great-grandfather. And as you were talking about repairs, I was getting totally emotionally bombarded with all of these things going through my head. Like they made reparations. Clinton apologized in 1997. They stopped at the generation, my father's generation. They said, oh, well, we're going to make these reparations. I'm using that word because we're talking about reparations, but they paid, my grandfather had died, but they paid off through my father's generation. And they received a check for something like $200 and something. And I'm still angered because it's embarrassing. So it doesn't matter that Clinton apologized. It doesn't matter that they gave them a measly check. It doesn't matter. It's an embarrassing situation. And I remember my mom talking about it often, how sick my great grandfather was and how she tried to convince him to go elsewhere for services. So I'm saying all that to say that now that I allowed myself to go through that emotional roller coaster and allow you to get to the point of the repair, I can see how repair is very important, because I started calming down, hearing the points and the station of repair. And it's very hard for me. I've taken classes, and I don't care what class it is, especially in psychology, that study comes up, and I very rarely comment on my relationship to any of the members of that study because it's so personal. But the other thing is, most people can't even identify with it. And so I just, I study it as someone who's just sitting in the room studying it, but I have that firsthand experience of hearing the story throughout my life. So I appreciate hearing about the repair. And I know this is reparations on a larger scale, but just that personal level of just having that little tiny check. And my aunt never cashed hers. My cousin still has it because she said it wasn't even worth her time to go and cash this check. She wanted it as a memory of what happened. So anyway, that's just, rambling. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That's not rambling at all. If you're all not familiar, and people may be, but there was a famous experiment. I think people call it the Tuskegee experiment, but the experiment was conducted on Afro-American men who had syphilis. Doctors pretended to administer treatment, but did not actually administer treatment because they wanted to let the disease run its course so that they could simply have the results with various people over time in order to study the progress of the disease, many things like that have happened. It's the most famous case of its type, but it reflects a racist disregard for human life. And I can't say what the worst part of it is, but one of the bad things about it is simply because, again, when you're emancipated without compensation, part of what that means is that other people know you don't have options. And people make decisions about you based on the fact that they know what condition you are historically in. And so it's a racist thing to do, but you wonder sometimes, well, even if you're a racist person, why would you bother to do that? Well, it's because medical experimentation usually happens to people who are vulnerable to it, who don't have other options or are kept from other options. And that's one of the pitfalls of racism, is not only that racist people do racist things, but you also don't have the necessary resources to explore other options. And I think sympathy for those types of situations is so important, not because sympathy is everything, because it's not, but it means something to know that other people know what happened was horrible, and that other people are willing to not only say that was horrible, but to support what you think needs to be done to make it right, to the extent that it can be made right. And part of our Christian heritage is that, non-white Christians have very rarely been able to trust Christians who are white to understand what has happened and to join, people of color in doing something about it. And that's something that people don't often say very much or very often, because why would you say that if you don't expect it to get any better? Why not just make the most of whatever the situation happens to be? And so that's the opportunity that, I'm very excited to share, is there is an opportunity to figure out what has gone on so that then we can engage in targeted and functional solidarities that then make future possibilities that are far beyond what people thought was possible because of what has taken place.
The book Medical Apartheid by Harriet Washington has a lot of those stories in it.
Right. And if people didn't hear that, it's a book called Medical Apartheid. And say the author's name again?
Harriet A. Washington.
Harriet A. Washington. Yeah, I've read pieces of that, but it's a
Pastor Jermaine, I have something to add. They can also read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, as well as the father of modern gynecology, who did all his research that is still in use today, and he did it on enslaved women. But my question pertains to the interconnectivity of indigenous people to Blacks, because I have a great grandmother who was full-blooded Miccosukee Indians. And after the Civil War, a lot of freed slaves intermarried with the indigenous people. And if you read the history of indigenous people in the state of Florida, I'm sure it happened in Oklahoma and the other states as well, where indigenous people were basically shuffled off to plantations. What we call Seminoles now were really a collection of other Florida different nations that were collected, but a lot of these had intermarriage with enslaved people as well. And so I'm not sure what the Presbyterian office has done on that piece of it, because that can have an impact as well on reparations. When you talked about the distinctiveness between the indigenous people and enslaved people, but that was also a survival reality. And again, none of this is ancient history. This is my great grandparents. So,
Okay.
Her name is in the family Bible, but there was that interconnectedness between indigenous people and former enslaved people.
Thank you for that. That's a good reminder. The distinction is important, but the interaction is as well. Yeah, the Presbyterian Church is new. I'm the only person I know, not only in the Presbyterian Church, but in any church, who has a full-time job directing a center for the repair of historic harms. So, like we said, nothing is that ancient in our American world. And so paying attention to the interrelation between indigenous folks and African-American folks is a new thing to pay attention to for the Presbyterian Church. But I will say, Elder Lona Street Stewart, former co-moderator, and she's also a colleague of mine through the organization Restorative Actions that I talked about earlier, through the Synod of Lakes and Prairies. She has continued to emphasize within our group the importance of paying attention to the relationships between people of African descent in this country and indigenous nations. Because, like I said before, there's a lot of history, especially here in Florida, but throughout this part of the world, where both churches and the federal government, have played a role in trying to keep those groups together, or trying to keep those groups apart, and also trying to suppress indigenous nations' rights. And so there's more work to be done. And so let's stay in touch, because I'm continuing to explore what those relationships are and how we can make solidarities to figure out what needs to and what can be repaired.
You have to act quickly, because it'll be against the law to talk about it in the state of Florida.
Well, that's true, but not in the church. Not in the church, though. So if the church upholds the truth and tells the truth, then people should be flocking to the church.
They're looking at that right now too.
So we may have something to resist in a faithful way. But I think that's, again, why I said we have to be able to transform the environment, because the church is going to have to do what the schools will no longer be allowed to do, which is not only educate people about the historical facts, but to help train people spiritually so that we have an attitude of love for one another as children of God, so that we can hear what has happened and we can be able to ask together, what can we do to fix it? And, you know, some people thought once upon a time that the classroom was part of the place where you do that. And people are realizing that that is the jurisdiction of the state. And if certain type of people get in control of certain parts of the state, then you can't teach things that are truth and common sense. But if you drive truth and common sense out of the church too, because it's divisive or because it hurts people's feelings or because you think Jesus is only interested in your spirit, then you'll see a weird synergy. Like the church can't be like that while the school is also becoming like that. The church has to remain and expand as a place of truth telling so that people can not only tell the truth about what has happened, but tell the truth about what it is that God makes possible. And I don't think we know quite yet, even as church people, we don't know what God makes possible. We think we know, but we don't have any idea. And I think the best is really yet to come. As long as we just to get serious and to learn how to make friends and how to talk to people the right way and have patience, not patience where we lie, but patience where we believe that that other person, they can be transformed and the Holy Spirit is also transforming them. Then the church will be as powerful as the church needs to be and can be when we stop trying to brush things under the rug to go along and get along. Mm-hmm. When we stop doing that and say there's nothing we can't face because of who God is, then we'll see some things that will challenge the powers that be. Because there's nothing more powerful than people who decide that they're going to cross boundaries and not ignore, but you know what I mean? Treat race as something people made up and treat race as a problem to be solved and treat your sister and your brother and your siblings in Christ as the people God has called you to solve those problems with. The state can't fight that. They'll try, but they can't fight it once we decide to do that because that means God is on our side. And I think God's been waiting for us to wake up to that possibility for a really long time. And I see it. I see us starting to wake up to that possibility. I mean, this room, you know, I mean, nothing against the fellas, but, you know, it's not meaningless that the majority in this room are women. The church has always been blessed by a majority of women who know better than the men have for a long time about what change requires. And
Thank you for.
yeah, I mean, no offense, but I mean, it's no mistake that in the afternoon that we have faithful women here who are willing to look things in the face and call it what it is and to figure out what can be done. And, you know, to God be the glory.